Should I drink coffee while doing this? Do you think it's a good idea?
Yeah, what could go wrong? It's very cartoonish. It just reminds me of like being a kid watching cartoons.
Yes, I like it. Good morning, man. Gotta say, you're the best looking guy I've ever seen in front of plywood. Like the camera is looking sharp. You get the nice
Thank you.
microphone.
Yeah, well, I just actually put the plywood here so I could get that kind of compliment. I mean, if you just put me in front of sheetrock, then all of a sudden you've seen a lot better looking guys in front of sheetrock.
Yeah, that's true. And I've seen a lot of guys in front of that sheetrock.
Oh
Let me
yeah.
be clear, that gypsum. But when it comes to the mic stand, it also looks like you got it off your forehead. It's looking a little nicer.
Oh man, it's like, I was showing you the electrical tape the other day. It's turning into a whole thing. The arm is giving out. I think this will last for maybe 15 minutes and then it's just going to start.
Just so everyone's clear, Ryder is pointing off camera to his wife, who's holding the microphone. Oh, well, good morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, February 3rd. Words are hard. And this wasn't a planned thing, so give me a second to pull it up, but I'm going to try and pull up my camera from my phone here because I was walking from the bathroom a second ago and I was like, hey, it's snowing outside, or it snowed outside. So let's see if I can do this. Let's see. Switch over here. Did you see the snow yet? Have you been out of doors?
Oh, yes. I've been out of the doors.
All right,
There's
let's see
somebody
here.
using a chainsaw in the neighborhood next door.
Oh, that sounds like a great song or a horror movie or something. Oh, the camera's not working, so we'll pass on that one for. Oh, there it is. Oh, there we go. Let's see here. Snow.
Snow. It's very sleety, slushy snow.
Hey, you can still totally make a snowman with it, right?
You could throw a sleet ball.
A sleet ball. That actually
Mm.
sounds really painful, and
Yeah.
maybe like a
Oh
great
yeah.
idea. It's like paintball meets snowball fights. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And if you do it in a parking lot, you can just put some gravel in there. Yeah. It's fun for everybody.
Gravelly sleet balls. I like it.
Yeah. No, there's last night we heard like a tremendous boom around like, I don't know, 10:30 or so. So I think one of
Yeah,
the
Danielle and I were busy at that time.
yeah, it was like a sonic boom.
Yeah,
So fast.
real fast, real fast.
That's how quick you are. Yeah. Yeah, so we heard this boom. We think, of course, it's like an electrical transformer or something going off because I don't know what's going on. And then this morning, I'm walking out to the shop at like, I don't know, 5:30 or something this morning, and I hear another boom. And just this tremendous boom. And then about 30 minutes later, somebody starts up with a chainsaw. So I'm assuming like a tree fell or something. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, that's the first thing I assume when I hear someone with a chainsaw next door. Just at 10:30 at night,
Yeah, right.
Did
Oh
it
yeah,
go?
no,
Did you
this
hear
was
like a
5:30 this
gurgly
morning
sound
for the
at any
chainsaw.
point?
Yeah. I heard a lot of high-pitched squealing and screaming, but,
Yeah, it's
it's,
all the motor, right?
yeah, right. Uh,
Well, all right. Let's go ahead and jump over to our recap from yesterday. So yesterday, we didn't have Ryder on because we were talking about science. And when you talk about science, you can't have some artsy fartsy dude in here. So
don't believe.
you
I'm
don't-
not a believer.
Yeah, he's from Roswell, so I'm just saying. Yeah, yesterday when we were doing that, we had Alexandra on. And so we talked about science. We talked about the scientific method. We talked about the process of how you go from a She said it. One of the things she said is usually not an aha moment that starts some sort of scientific experiment. It's more of like a I wonder why that is. And then after you have that aha moment, look at that. See, I'm mixing that up already. After you have that moment, you then go and look and see what is out there, what already exists in the world, what research has been done, and then you turn that into hypothesis, and you say, oh, and that we used a little fun example yesterday where it says, hey, if rabbits eat a bunch of carrots, their ears will stick up. And so we said, okay, that's our hypothesis. And then you set up an experiment to test that. You have the control group you don't do anything to, and then you have the experiment group where you give them all the carrots, and you see what happens. You collect all the data, and then you end up analyzing that data, see what you can figure out. And ideally, it's a statistically significant sample, and ideally, there's statistically significant difference or things, association between the independent and dependent variable and other fun words like that. But after you do all the data, you write up the report, you send it out, and you get it peer reviewed. And that's where you have a bunch of other scientists who look at it and say, hey, this is good, this is bad, you maybe need to change these things. Oh, you missed this entire body of work. What were you thinking? And they repeat on that a little bit. Eventually send it to a journal where it goes out to the public, and it gets spread even wider. More people read it, more people look at it, and then they come back and say, hey, that was great.
How people
that was
love
bad.
reading those scientific journals.
That's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
I was
People are into that. It really spreads far and wide.
I know, and I was like, believe it or not, people, because I'm disbelief just as you are. Some of these people just on a Sunday, just like, oh, let me just go ahead and grab the next, topic on nucleophysical chemotudes.
Yeah. Oh, it's only a $500 subscription a year to get access to this journal. It's worth it.
Totally worth it, because you're worth it too, L'Oreal. Or one of those companies.
Yeah. Also, I have to go back to this rabbit thing. My dad used to tell me that the carrots actually helped the rabbits with their vision. And that's because he'd never seen a rabbit wearing glasses. So
Dad coming in strong with the carrot, the dad joke. I like it. Which is actually, I think there's some truth to that. I think carrots have carotene in it or something. That vitamin, one of those vitamin E, maybe. I don't know, letters. But yesterday we ended up with our challenge. We had a kind of a 2-part challenge, depending on which one appealed more to you, and of course you can always do both. And one of them was which I know which one Ryder would have taken. It was probably this one, which was to go read a scientific paper, to go find something that you're kind of interested in or just curious about, and go look at a scientific paper. And I was like, yeah, you don't have to drudge through all the stuff in the middle, but you can easily read an abstract and an introduction and a conclusion. And then the other section that Alexandra mentioned was the one, I forget the fancy name for it, but it's not the conclusion, but it says, hey, we, as people who know bunnies very well, we think that, we just studied these dwarf bunnies, but we think this has broader implications to the rest of the bunny world. But we don't have data to show that yet. But they kind of say, if we were to do another test, that's what we would do next. So part 1 of the challenge was to go read a scientific paper. Part 2 was to design a science experiment for fun. And that one, I mentioned one I think I did as a kid was testing, comparing acid levels of orange juice based off the different types of pulp it had. And I mentioned that yesterday and said, look, you need an excuse to have some mimosas or manmosas during the week. Go ahead and call it a science experiment and say, I did it for science.
I know. I was testing all the acids by ingesting all of them into my belly.
Yes.
Then let's just see what happens.
Exactly. And then the last thing we talked about was, or at least one of the other last things we talked about was, we pointed out how, with our stuff, Kickstart Your Kitchen, and our credit card guide, we've done a bunch of research. We wanted to make sure it was science-based, data-based, and we've now released it out into the world, and we're waiting to hear back from other more nerdy, smart people who say, no, you messed that part up, or, oh, please add this other thing, or this extra information came out after you publish it, because that's what we're all about. We're going to update it. We're going to keep it going. And I wanted to share last thing, then we'll move on. I had a listener send us a couple of articles yesterday. They're like, "Hey, you mentioned how they do these they publish these things, and then they go to get peer reviewed or whatever. Then they get published in the journal, and then they get some comments back." Well, here's one. It was called "Everything is Awesome. Don't Forget the Lego." And it's in the Journal of Pediatrics, and it's a study that's about kids swallowing Lego heads, and then it passing through their stool. And it says, "We think no one has studied this enough, and so we've now got a collection of people who have volunteered to do this test." And then they went super technical, and they had this diagram of the Lego head, and they measured it out, all this stuff, and it's a satire, but it's funny because they published this thing. They even had this score that ended up being an acronym, poop, and another score that was like fart, and it was like based on the scientific measures. I was like, this is good. And then to top it off, someone wrote in, and their comment was like, we also very scientific sounding, but then they came up with their own diagram of the Lego head, and they used the Lego head to like show like the cycle of like digestion or something. It was pretty great.
Ah, yeah, that's good. Yeah, somebody spent a lot of time on that.
Yes. No, the first one especially, I'm like, this is long. I'm like, goodness. And my only complaint was like, all right, as a journal, I think you need to put a disclaimer at the top, make it obvious, say, hey, this is satire, because that's one of the things with all fake news and all that kind of stuff now these days. It's like, hey, let's make sure, scientific journals, the things that aren't actually fully scientific, let's make sure that it's somewhat marked, at least somewhere on the page. You know what I mean?
Well, what's funny about it is uh, there's such a good commentary in there about some of the articles that are published in some of these journals, is that the content really is frivolous. Yet it's real research. Like, you could really do this research, and they might have actually done this research on the Legos being swallowed. Like, and the funny thing is, it might be satire, but at the same point, like, just kind of making that point that one of the things that I've heard about, at least in academia with a lot of the journals, is that they publish these articles that are very niche and nuanced and don't actually move the field forward. It's actually just about getting published, because that's what you need to do to move your career ahead. So you just pick some topic, you dig down really deep, you pull together a bunch of data, you get it published, and that gets you a job in the future. But is it, I don't even think there's a moment going on.
Well, it's
There's
more like
just
a.
like,
Oh, you weren't talking about this specific study. Sorry.
no, not really, but it's okay. Yeah. No, I like the idea that they're just saying, well, this is something that has not been published yet. This is something I can use to further my career. And you kind of start wondering about or at least personally, I do. I start wondering about sort of what's chosen to get published, why it gets published, because sometimes they go to peer review and they don't get published, right? And it takes years for these things to go through the review process, and sometimes they get rejected. But there's also algorithms that can now write these papers for you. So they have examples of algorithms that are writing journal articles, and they basically just take sort of the language and the context, and then they put a spin on it, and they spit something out, and then they'll send it in for peer review. It gets peer reviewed, and it sounds super smart, and it gets published, but there's nothing behind it.
Yeah.
Just to sort of point out how this jurying and peer review process can be corrupted. So anyway, just throwing that out there as
Yeah.
an aside. I haven't gotten far enough into it to even to really know. I just listen to some of my friends talk about this stuff, and they just bring up, oh, and did you hear about that? And did you hear about that? And like, so there's people who are just doing nothing but gaming this peer review system, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, there's a thing about systems and a thing about humans, which is that whenever there's a system, the humans are going to try and figure out a way to game the system, right? Which actually dovetails in perfectly to our conversation today. We're going to be talking about innovation and regulation. So let's go ahead and run our intro, and then we'll get into that discussion. Helpful for life. All right. Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, bacterium, what aliens, whatever you are listening to this broadcast, welcome. We come in peace.
He does.
Yeah, Ryder, not so much. I hear one day when he's riding around with his truck, he keeps his BB gun in his rack. He's ready to go. And if you're really mean, he'll give you 10 pumps, not just 5. Supercharged.
Oh, that BB gun, that was a one pump BB gun too. That was the old Red
Suiting for
Ryder
you.
BB gun.
Suiting for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, thanks. One pump jump.
Yeah. So, welcome to What the Hell is Water, everybody. The only show where we start off our intro to our professional show with penis jokes. Probably not the only show. Let's be real. That's probably a lot of shows. This is episode 85. What was that, Ryder?
Oh, it's just any joke, can be turned into a penis joke. I'm pretty sure. Like, we should do a scientific study on that. Maybe get it published.
I don't know. It seems kind of hard. But today is episode 85, and it's February 3rd, so welcome, everybody. We hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to be talking about innovation and regulation. We want to talk about, one, why do they need to exist at all? Why are they important? What kind of changes do they bring into the world or prevent from happening in the world? And who should be in charge of them? Is it private companies? Is it the government? Is it third-party regulations that are set up by companies or nonprofits or interested people? It seemed to be kind of right on cue with the peer review discussion. And one of the things I also wanted to point out was, along the same lines of the peer review, as we were doing research for Kickstart Your Kitchen and Swipe Right, the credit card guide, I found some things. I was like, oh, this is quoted on multiple websites. It seems like this is a good thing. And then I was like, let me go to the source. Let me make sure to go to the primary source to see what it is and check. And I found it, and there was something that was published in a journal, and it sounded super professional, and it actually was like an experiment. But I was like, when I started looking, I'm like, okay, the sample size here is really small. It seems like they're missing a couple of really important things to have a good study. And then I looked into the journal itself a little bit more, and it was basically a pay-to-play journal. They're like, hey, you just pay us some money, submit it to us, and we will publish it. Now, obviously, they don't say it in that simple of language, but yeah. Have you heard of that before?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I think that, there's, in the art world, there's a lot of pay-to-play galleries and publications you can get published in. There's art residencies you can do that are pay to play. And then there's other ones that are award based, right? So the award based are harder to get into. And especially if there's a stipend involved where they give you some money. So there's different kinds of ways that these things are set up. But yeah, when you're talking about pay to play with journals, there's also entire think tanks that publish their own political leanings and ideas, and they put them out into the world in ways that can help their agenda, basically reshaping public opinion so that they can get policy passed.
Yeah, and that's the thing about science and innovation and regulation is they're so intertwined. And the reality is even if none of this sounds interesting to you at all, it's affecting your entire life, whether or not you realize it. So let's go ahead and dive in. Would you like to start with innovation or regulation?
Let's start with innovation. It sounds more fun.
It does, doesn't it? I was like, yeah. I was thinking innovation, but I don't know. I don't know.
Hey, whatever. Yeah. So innovation. One of the things when I was this morning, I looked over the sort of agenda with the innovation and regulation, and my first thought was like innovation being like burgeoning new science, and my first thought was like Dr. Frankenstein. Is like, it's like I found a way to raise the dead. Like I have innovated, and then you're just like, I wish somebody would have regulated that guy, but yeah, there is this kind of idea, like the dark side of innovation instantly came up to me, which is like damage to humans or taking advantage of humans or testing things on them that shouldn't be tested or something like that. And so I was kind of going down this path about like, yeah, there is that. There's also sort of technical innovation, and there's innovation of ideas. There's all these kind of things that go out there. And what's fascinating to think about is, one, like, are there dangerous ideas? Are there ideas that are so dangerous that we should not be innovating in that direction? The other one is like with technology, like, yes, this can allow your life to be easier, but what are the ramifications from that? Or do you give away too much data, for instance? Things like that by using this. Like, do you open up another can of worms by releasing these things? If you go into innovation in terms of like nuclear weapons, like what does, that was a huge innovation. What's the fallout, so to
Yeah.
speak,
Oh, nice. Wow. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you.
Wait,
Thank you.
actually, I don't know if you knew that was coming, but that was pretty well
Oh,
timed with the
I
hand
knew
pump.
it.
Okay, good. Yeah, he recognized the look in the eyes. Oh, he's
Yeah,
going for the.
with the eyes were.
No, there's a lot of things that popped in my head there. First off, I wanted to point out, because we didn't mention the recap yesterday, but one of the things we talked about yesterday was the COVID vaccine, and that's a natural example of regulation. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they regulate drugs that people have to take or that people take, right, including vaccinations. And normally, it's a 10-year process that takes testing and all that kind of stuff for things to get approved. But yet, the COVID vaccine, it got turned around in one, and so that was an interesting thing. And we were like, some people were like, why did it take so long? And other people like Alexander was like, I had never thought they would get anywhere close to as quick as they did. And so that's one of the things about speed and having the regulation to control it. And then one of the things you mentioned is, are there certain things that can be invented that could cause harm or issues. And you mentioned, nuclear testing and nuclear bombs and things like that, which for those familiar with World War II, saw some of the fallout from that with the destruction of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah.
Mhm.
And, yeah, and that it changed the world forever, and the way people think about war. The Cold War probably existed largely because those bombs were existed, and then there's some things that aren't quite as obvious that they're going to be so bad or destructive. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of ways the most obvious example, right? It literally goes boom and explodes a very large area and then has a bunch of radiation that lasts and contaminates the area. So that's a pretty obvious downside. But there's some that don't have quite as obvious downsides. And one that was in the news within the last few years is a technology called CRISPR. And that's the ability to edit DNA. And so say, hey, I want to have this kid, but you know what? He has that writer gene. Let's make sure to erase that one.
We need more writers, just lots of tiny writers.
Lots of tiny writers. Yeah, there you go. But yeah, you can edit the genes. And so it's like, okay, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Hey, maybe I could edit this gene that takes away, that it lowers the risk of you getting cancer or something like that. But the reality is, we don't know the implications of these things, because the reality is you can never know. You can only postulate and theorize, and you can reduce like the risk. But at the end of the day, if you change that gene, until someone is born and lives with it and lives a full life, like, you don't know what could happen, what could go wrong. Maybe at like age 40, their bones dissolve or something like that.
Yeah, the old bone dissolving genetic problem. I'm pretty sure that does exist.
Yes.
I've seen what is it? Glass, the M. Night Shyamalan, the
I've not seen that
Samuel
one.
L. Jackson. One of the characters has like really brittle bones. And
I
so
like it.
anyway, okay, yeah, I'm kind of like there's some interesting things too about innovation as far as we go back to this like nuclear weapon thing, right? There's apparently this was an arms race and it was going to happen because it could happen. It could be invented, so it was going to be. And so one of the things that I kind of enjoyed about or enjoy thinking about is the implications. It will happen, what won't happen, who can control this power, has actually creating nuclear weapons, like the idea of mutually assured destruction. Does that change the face of what we're actually willing to do now and actually introduce a new kind of ethics into war that wasn't there previously? Like, there starts to become these really broad implications by sort of unleashing this new innovation. And so there's people who are going to claim that it's great that it happened, that the cost was worth it.
Right.
And so you kind of get into these ideas about when you get into innovation, like, is this like, what are the long-term implications? Will this help? Who should be innovating? And then there's this other weird one where, like with CRISPR, or like for instance, they'd have what is the one with sheep where they've done their DNA where they actually have blue wool because blue is a very expensive dye, and so if you
Oh,
can genetically alter them to have their wool come in as a bluish color, then you have to use less dye when you're dyeing the wool. So, there becomes this kind of cost efficiency ratio, and then like, should we do this? Probably not, but we're going to anyway because it's cool. You
yeah.
know,
And well, one of the things about that is like, for whatever reason, mostly because it's not us, like we as humans are inherently more comfortable, at least we as a lot of humans, there are plenty of people who are against this, right? But more comfortable with doing these things and testing these things on animals, right?
yeah, the animal testing, of course, is better than human testing, but there's also this side of there's a lot of people now who are just like, animal testing is cruel as well, and so you get into, especially with makeup, that was a big deal. They tested on all these animals. What's fascinating is when it's bunnies, then people get really offended, but when
Because they're
it's
so
rats,
cute.
apparently no one cares.
Yeah, gross, ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the
So
other
the
things,
cuteness factor is
yeah.
also, I don't know. There's something in there that's really a little bit twisted about human nature.
Well, it'd be interesting, and I don't know, for example, are rats or mice, because they seem to be like the best or the most often used experiment subject. And I'm sure, I know, I would hope at least that there are a bunch of other reasons why that's good. I mean, I imagine they're easy to. Yeah, I'm not going to go into all the reasons, right? But it would be funny to say, if it was instead like bunnies that we had from the beginning, like how different would our civilization be because of certain things got tested or didn't get tested, or like they were trying to test something but they were looking at the cute little bunny and like, I can't do it.
Yeah. Well, what's also like, how badly do we need makeup if you have to kill a bunny, right? Like you have to start gauging the priorities. And some people are like, yeah, kill the bunny. Like,
Yeah. Hey,
and you're just like,
hundreds of
whoa.
millions of people will look better. It was worth that bunny's life.
Or it was
Do
worth
you see
hundreds
that
of millions
contour
of
though?
bunnies.
Look at that.
Chiseled.
Defined.
Yeah, that's one of the other interesting things is getting into what the costs. We're starting to talk a little bit about innovation and having these positive negative costs, and some people are fine with the costs. Some people are fine with blowing up cities for this greater good kind of cost. Other people aren't, and so that's where things start getting really weird and political. And then when you start talking about regulation, which when we sort of move into that, that's, you know, how do you sort of balance between those different kinds of people? That gets really into politics. It gets
Right.
into um, how you spread your idea, what the current social climate and narrative is. Like, ooh, yeah, that's
Yeah,
tricky.
no, for sure. Let's wait on the innovation or the regulation for a little bit longer. I want to talk a little bit about the nuclear development for a second. Then I want to talk about the tech angle of innovation. The innovation we're seeing today, if you will. And a la Facebook and that type of thing, and the implications of those, which are not as obvious, but are now more and more obvious to a larger number of people. So we'll get to that in a second. But first, let's talk about the nuclear development. So for those who aren't familiar, the way the nuclear bomb was developed, the first successful nuclear test was done in the football stadium in Chicago. So in case you didn't know that, there's a fun little fact. It's like under the bleachers, they're testing a nuclear reaction in Chicago. So that's just kind of a fun thing, fun little fact for you guys. And it wasn't too long after that they decided they should go do that testing elsewhere, and they ended up places more like where writers are grown, more
Yeah, yeah.
deserty, away from
Way out in New
people.
Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they went out into the desert where they couldn't, there's really not a whole lot left to kill.
They're like, the plants already look weird. I mean, look at this one. It's kind of got
I
arms. Like, what's up with that? It's spiky.
It's like the Family Guy, like when he falls, like all the plants are shaped like that.
Nice. And so as the nuclear technology got developed, originally it got developed for this wartime effort. And that's one of the good things about war and crisis is that it can be a thing that spurs on innovation. If you look at when there are big spikes in technology, a lot of times it's corresponding to some type of war. Because guess what? Oh, we want to kill the other people more than they want to kill us, or we want to kill them more effectively or better, or have the bigger weapon or whatever. And then so basically, the competition aspect inspires innovation, and so World War II brought that on. The nuclear development started going. There's some interesting details in there about how German engineers and things like that end up coming over and all that kind of stuff. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, and I'm going to push back on that for just a second too,
Go for it.
because one of the, I agree. Yes, innovation comes, but it's not just from war. It seems to be from the willingness of the government to create an initiative and put a lot of money behind it.
Yes, no,
So
that
same
is a
with
good
war plus the
broader. Yeah.
COVID vaccine is that the government opened up the purse strings and said, make this happen. And all of a sudden, bam, innovation.
Yeah, and actually, that's what they said when they signed it. Bam! Innovation.
Yeah.
The emerald of technology. Bam! Innovation. No, and I that's a great point. It is not always war, but I would say if you look at the history, war is probably percentage-wise one of the bigger things. Famine, the Great Depression. These are times where it's like, hey, some crisis is going on. Maybe crisis would be a better, more general term. Now we're willing to spend a bunch of money. Or, for example, in the Cold War, that was another time where there wasn't actually fighting going on, but there was a bunch of technology development because we were trying to develop the bigger gun. But back to nuclear stuff. So it started out, did the bombs, things like that. However, it also led to us having something called nuclear power, which is an extremely efficient type of power, and it's very good for the environment and these types of things once you learn how to deal with the radiation. However, because of things like the nuclear bombs, and then there's like the nuclear meltdowns that happen, for example, in 3 Mile Island and the earthquakes in Japan a few years ago. And when you have those types of things, when it comes to nuclear stuff, people get really scared and they're like, oh, well, we don't want nuclear power because it's bad. And it gets oversimplified. But yet that could be and will be probably a very large source of energy for the world, especially as we go towards more green sources and things like that. And so then that gets to where, hey, people are scared and they have that fear. So then they work with the government to basically enforce regulation. And that led to there not being as much nuclear power plant development because people were scared. And so you could argue that maybe the energy situation would look a little bit different if people were willing to put some money behind it. And that's a big thing to think about when it comes to innovation, especially in the US, is are the people behind the thing? Because if they're not behind the thing, if they're not interested in the thing, then the taxpayer money is not going to go there. The congressmen aren't going to fight for it. And a good example of when it was in favor is when we were doing the space race down in the 60s. People were all about it. So we pumped all sorts of money because, one, it was a pretty straightforward thing. Let's shoot our penis-shaped thing up into the sky and prove that it's bigger and faster and gets there before the other guy. The one time you wanted to be faster, that it was like, we got to beat the Russians. And that was a simple enough message to sell to the average person. Say, let's beat those damn commies. And then we did. We did it. Well, we didn't exactly, but in some ways we did.
I couldn't help but also thinking about the Tesla Edison kind of thing, right? Where so much of this was about the salesmanship. Do you want AC or DC, right? And there became big battles for the propaganda, the sort of selling of the thing to get people behind it and getting other people scared, right? And so there's these kind of innovation battles, and sometimes we basically take the wrong path. We end up, like we've talked about, things like the USB or maybe the MP3, these little technological kind of things that happen which are not the best platform. And yet,
USB-C.
yeah, right, all these things show up and you just go, oh, well, okay, there becomes enough traction behind it, the thing gains momentum and it just keeps going on its own. Like, why in the world was the way to beat communists to get to the moon? That doesn't actually make sense. If we actually wanted to beat the communists, why didn't we just like invest into better people and infrastructure and make a healthier, wealthier society that was
That's
so
boring.
good that it would overtake them, right? No, we needed a tangible goal, and it was to send people into outer space, right? Like, I think these notions, like, I don't know where they come from. But you're right, as far as the innovation to get to space also produced all sorts of other stuff. So the fallout from the space race was all sorts of innovation in other ways, things like microwaves and, different kinds of writing implements and innovations in, what is it, ceramic technology for heat and heat dissipation, stuff like that. And I'm just kind of running off the cuff with this, but I do
Yeah.
think that there's something very bizarre about coming up with these crazy schemes and being like, yeah, let's sell that to the public and then dump a ton of money into it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing though is you can't underestimate the value of the symbol, right? And the value of something that is so clear, so obvious that an average person does not need to be educated that much on it, but they can get behind it and they can be like, yeah, let's do that. And some of that's from, nationalism, patriotism, and pride, and be like, oh, yeah, we want to be better. And like, this is a very clear way to say we're better. Like, if you talk to the average person and you say, well, our GDP is better and we have a lower unemployment rate and a better housing rate and our streets are better. Like, okay, well, if it's taking that much longer to explain, it's harder to sell, right? And that's more true now than ever in our 5-second video world. But even back then, like, it's like you got to get out your message. You got to make sure everyone can easily get behind it. And so those are some of the reasons why I think, it's like, oh, rocket going up to the moon is the way, right? But of course, we can't talk about all this stuff without mentioning we talked a lot about the moon on episode 82 a couple of days ago when we talked about moonshots, astrology, things like that. And moonshots, of course, ties in very well with this innovation idea. Are you familiar with the term moonshot, by the way, Ryder?
No, no.
So the term moonshot basically it's something that is so far fetched, like going to the moon, which now seems silly because we've done it, right? But it's like that is such a difficult thing to do that it is so there's a high chance it might fail, right? And so there's companies that do these things where they invest in what they call moonshots, and one of the most popular ones is Google, now Alphabet, but we'll just call them Google because that's simpler. And what they do is they fund these moonshots that are like, oh, this probably won't turn into anything, but if we could achieve it, it could be really cool. And of course, the phrase, if you shoot for the moon, you might land among the stars. So even if you fail at doing that big thing, you're going to figure out some really good stuff along the way. And kind of like you were talking about with the rockets and going to the moon, they did figure out a whole bunch of technology that we're still using today, like Teflon on our pans. That's another one that came from that era. I can't remember if duct tape is one of them, but that sounds familiar. But you can just Google. Yeah, you can just Google like technology we have thanks to space,
I think
and you'll find it.
Is one of them.
Did you say Tang? Yeah, with the champ.
Yeah.
That was the best innovation that we had for sure. So with these moonshots, that's a great transition to the innovation that's done a little bit more today by technology companies, if you will, right? So we mentioned Google, and because they were able to get success with their search engine, and they make most of their money from ads on their search engine, even still today. Like that's where the bulk of their money comes from. YouTube gives them a good chunk of money too, but then they have a bunch of smaller things that don't make them quite as much money. But because they had those cash cows, they had a lot of money that they could invest in something, right? So this gets into a little bit of who should be paying for this thing. And a lot of times it's like, oh, well, should it be the government? Should it be a company? Should it be a public-private partnership? So one of the big examples that comes up for me when I think about innovation and regulation is our telecommunications infrastructure. So for those who aren't aware, right now, as we're going over the internet, or maybe you're watching this on your cell phone or whatever, those towers, those cables, those wires, those all had to be dug into the ground. They had to go be built. They had to go people put up all these fancy antennas, and those had to be built out across the entire country. And when you're doing innovation, when you're developing your civilization, there's this thing where it's like, hey, we as a country recognize that this would be better for everyone if we can do these kind of things. If we could get internet access to everyone in our country, even though maybe financially it doesn't make sense for us to give writer who lives out on a farm in the middle of nowhere to dig lines to his house because it doesn't really make sense because he can't pay enough to pay back that trench. But because of those types of things, that's where you start to get the government comes in and says, hey, we'll pay for some of that. And so what happened back in the day was the government subsidized the infrastructure for all of our communication stuff. And then you got into this weird thing, though, where the private company, even though they were built with the help of the government, they now controlled the pipes. And then you start to get into some antitrust and monopoly discussions because it's like, hey, this telecommunication company, which was largely Bell Communications back in the day, AT&T, which it later got split up into more things. But when they are controlling the pipes and they say, hey, we get to control the price now because we control the pipes of information that come to you. So then that's the downside of when you get government involved is, all right, how do you do it right to where you can give the cash? Maybe you have the benefits of the private, the competition, the capitalism, all that type of stuff. But doing it in a way where they don't end up with a monopoly, they don't end up with all the power, things get hairy pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean it's really really quite complicated, and there's a lot of people who are trying different ways of doing it. So I was chatting with a guy on Friday who was from the Northeast. I think he was like from Michigan, and this guy was a contractor, and he was talking about how unions work. Versus coming down here to Texas to try to be a contractor in Texas. And he's talking about these commercial contracts, and in Texas, how if you don't meet a deadline, then the other guys around you that you've sort of been working around and with, all the other subs, will work as hard as they can to burn you out of the field. They will try to, it's so cutthroat. He's like, they are just after you. And he goes, so it's very hard to make it. There's very little security or stability in Texas in a lot of these jobs. You're just jumping from job to job, and these other companies are, if you screw up once, they cut you off and they penalize you as much as possible to get you out of business. They said up in the Northeast, of course, you have unions, and if it takes, if there's a deadline approaching, then all of a sudden they'll drop 25 guys on a job just to help you get done with the job in time. So there's a different kind of support network. And then we started talking about the corruption of unions and what that leads to, which is, then people sort of claim price gouging, and there's all these other kinds of things that happen. And so there's multiple systems at play, and I don't know if we've always found the balance. I think there are examples of balance being found between them, like when you're getting the benefits of both. You both have sort of the stability and the speed and the security, and you can get to all these things. But I think that there's this tendency for people to sort of develop a stance that leans really heavy into one or the other, and then you sort of champion those qualities. One of the fascinating things is we're in the middle of a freeze here in Texas. And last year, when we had our freeze, we have privatized energy here in Texas. And basically, the grid went down. We had all these problems, and a lot of people were, really, freezing and put out of their home, and all these kind of things were happening. And our governor was like flying to Mexico or something like that. And so there became this thing where all of a sudden it became political, and people were blaming the governor for this problem. But I was thinking, this has been this way for a long time. And even if the governor was here, what's he going to do? He's just going to give you some words. It's not like he's going to get a pipe and go fix something.
Right.
So I'm kind of interested in how all this plays out. But when you privatize something, and the idea of a private entity that has shareholders is to get as close to that efficiency margin as you can, so you can make as much profit as possible with the least amount of expenditure. And the other side of that would be that if the government was in charge of it, it could probably cost 3 times as much, but they wouldn't be skimping on things in theory.
In theory.
But also, right, if they end up subcontracting it, maybe they're going with the lowest bidder, and you end up having other problems. So like, it's a mess. And I don't have enough insight to really have any information on it, but I have heard the multiple arguments.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So, my big boy job before I quit it and tried to become an internet celebrity, was working for Boeing, which is actually the largest exporter in the United States, in case you didn't know that. Fun fact for you. And so actually I had a bit of a vested interest in government and regulation and contracts and stuff like that, because a lot of It's like 45% or something like that of Boeing's revenue comes from the government, because it's through government contracts. And for those of you who are not aware, it's like, oh yeah, the government should do this. Well, guess what? Most of the time, when the government, quote unquote, does it, they're paying private companies to do the thing. There's only so many things that the government themselves actually do. And as Ryder alluded to, whenever you're contracting, for anyone who's ever done home contracting work or anything like that, you'll know there are a lot of issues that can come up. There's schedule, there's budget, and one example, which I hesitate to use because it's such a good thing and it's totally worth it, but is just an example of how this is part of innovation. Is like, you don't know how long some things are going to take because it's new. You don't know how much it's going to cost. Like, you can do your best estimates, and if you've done something similar before, you can use that to estimate what's going to happen. But your estimate's only so good. At the end of the day, it's going to take as long as it's going to take. And one of those examples that I'm thinking about was it was right here. It was right here in my head. The James Webb Space Telescope. We've talked about that once or twice on the show before, and it's a really cool thing that's going to let us see farther into space than we've ever seen before, and it may change everything. It may change the way that we look at the world. It may change what we know about how the universe was created. It could change a whole bunch of things. But it's funny because I hosted an event when I was out there in LA where the program manager for James Webb came and he talked about what they were doing. And I saw a picture I had where he had some slides, and it was like, oh, launch is going to happen in, I don't know, 2017 or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was. That was the end of the timeline. And it actually ended up just launching sometime within the last few months. So I think it was 2021. So 4 years later, and however many billions of dollars that it went over budget. But that's kind of what happens sometimes. So that's another thing that can be troublesome. And then there's also the aspect of now I'm not going to go down that route. But let's talk about let's shift over to the innovation of technology, right? And things that are more directly, quote unquote, applicable to the average layperson, the average person at home, right? So when it comes to technology innovation, there's this idea of one, the innovation happens, and then another thing that comes with that is you have some protection that helps you protect that innovation, so you can then get some money from it to pay off the investments that you took, right? That's kind of the agreement, or one of the ways that we've done this whole public and private partnership to help use capitalism and competition to instill innovation. And one example of that, where it can be troublesome. I said tech, but let's do an aside on the drug industry real quick, right? So, hey, if I am a drug company, one of the ways that I make money is with new drugs, right? And of course, there's a lot of people who question and have issues with that. Like, wait, why are you? And I've seen so many comments on Reddit like, oh, I'm from England. We've got all this free healthcare over here. You should come here and have a warm beer, and there's no ice in your drinks, but you should come here. It's great. And then whenever you need to go to the hospital, you don't have to pay 25 grand to get in a wee-wee. That's what they call ambulances over there. Or maybe it's a wah-wah. I can't remember. I made that up, by the way.
I hope no one wants to get in anybody's wee-wee.
Nice callback to our penis jokes. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
So we're when it comes to the drug industry, and they are saying, hey, we're gonna make this new thing, and maybe it's a vaccine, maybe it's the new solve for cancer, maybe it's fixing diabetes, but I, as a drug company, invest millions and millions of dollars. And then the government lets me have exclusive right to that drug for a certain number of years before it becomes a generic. And so, for example, something that's been around for a very long time, Tylenol. Well, that's actually, the drug is called acetaminophen. And so when you go to the store, you can look and you can see the brand Tylenol, or you can buy any of the generic drugs, which are the same thing. They have the same active ingredient, acetaminophen. But Tylenol had an exclusive on that for a certain numbers of years. I don't know how long, but that number actually starts, I think, whenever the drug patent or whatever it's called begins. And so there's actually a race for them to get to market. Let's say the number is 10 years. I don't know what it is, but let's say it's 10 years. Well, they start developing it or whatnot, and they may not even make it to market until year 4 or whatever. So then they only actually have 6 years before that they can profit off of it. And then the question is, hey, can we make enough money during that time to pay for all of those expensive tests, expensive scientists, and things like that? Any thoughts on the innovation in the drug world, or not so much?
Oh, I my first thought was of like Gatorade. It was kind of interesting that you were going into drugs, and I was
So
like, I
hold on,
think
you're thinking about Tang and Gatorade, man. Do you need
yeah, I know,
something
I'm really
orange? You need some
thirsty,
orange drink?
dehydrated. Yeah, it's these kind of there is a race to get to that point, right? But you get to like garner market share during that time. One of the things about the drug trade as well is the promotion and the advertising during this window is how you sort of gain reputation and market share within the space. You make the name so common that people are just like, they go, oh, they don't even call other sports drinks, they just call them all Gatorade. You know, I'm the kind of person that calls all soft drinks Coke,
Right.
right? And so there becomes this kind of default where there's enough market share in a space where it becomes sort of a default to something. And so that's kind of what happens with Tylenol or something like that. There's an example as well, if you can ever dig it up. Whenever Okay, so China didn't believe in depression, so they would show up and say, hey, by the way, you all look depressed, you need Prozac. And everyone's like, nope, this is just life. And they're like, no, you're depressed. And they're like, no, just life. But there's like 16 billion people or some insane number of people in China. So they ended up having to launch a marketing campaign that took them, I think, 2 years to indoctrinate everyone to think that they were depressed so that they could open up the market for antidepressants in China. So
Interesting.
yeah, because so that's the other side of this kind of innovation, is that you also have to market and pitch and sell the product to gain that share so that you can profit from it within that window of time.
Yeah, and you can't talk about innovation and you can't talk about business. In my opinion, you can't really talk about life without thinking about and talking about incentives. Because at the end of the day, we as humans, especially I think the more selfish, individualistic, which is, by the way, we as a U.S. culture, we're very much more individualistic than we are collectivistic, which would mean we're more about togetherness and all of us, right? I mean, America, F yeah. But anyways, the more we are kind of about ourselves, the more that we want for ourselves, well, we're going to go for what the incentives are. And so when you see things like, hey, okay, we as a company are incentivized to sell more of this thing. We as executives, we get our bonuses based on how much we sell of this thing, how well we market this, what percent of the market share we get. We literally get paid more because of those things. And when you have those incentives, that can lead to sorts of issues like you're talking about, where it's like, hey, we're going to go poison the well so we can sell them the antidote, right? But go ahead.
Oh no, just it's a classic technique, right? Is to create the problem while you're selling the solution.
Yeah, and I also wanted to point out, in case for those of you who are or have not heard about it, the whole writer calling things Coke as a generic. There's a map which we'll share in the chat that shows of the U.S. the pop soda Coke triangle. It says, all right, based on where you are, what region of the country you're in, you're more likely to call them certain things, and it's the South and the Southeast especially that calls Coke, which is a brand, the entire name for, oh, I'll have a Coke, and then the waitress is supposed to respond, which kind? Oh, is that a Dr. Pepper or Pepsi? And then of course you go up north and like, hey, you want a pop? You want a pop or a soda on the roof? Have a bagel while you're at it.
No.
I'm trying to see how many regions I can piss off in one time. I got England. Well, I've got the North. Should we go to California next?
Keep rolling. Is that what they do?
Yeah. So let's jump back to the tech, because that was one of the things I said we wanted to talk about. So for those who are familiar with Facebook, now Meta, one of their phrases they had early on was "move fast and break things," which is kind of exact opposite of what regulation is, right? But because of that, they were able to do things. They were able to make a big cultural splash. However, now we as a world now, and not just the country, right? We as a world are now dealing with the implications of the things that they've now done. And people are arguing, hey, maybe we now should go do a little bit more regulation. And now maybe we should consider breaking these people up because they're too big. They have a monopoly. And they, oh, by the way, they went and bought up other things. Like, for example, Facebook, when they acquired Instagram, a lot of people say, maybe that shouldn't have happened because now there's
Don't
less
they have
competition.
WhatsApp
They
and
have
something
WhatsApp
like
as well.
Venmo? I'm
They don't
not
have
sure if
Venmo.
is
Venmo's owned
Venmo
by
PayPal?
PayPal. Yep.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this thing about consolidation, and that happens a lot of times. Is like, hey, if we can acquire these other companies, one, we're no longer competing with each other, which is better for us as a company, even though it may be worse for the market. And then, I want to say Facebook even tried to buy Snapchat at one point. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, if one overall company ends up owning all of the things, then you end up having issues. Another example is the very popular example is the glasses market, the prescription glasses market. And so you, in the prescription glasses market, despite basically all of the companies having these different names, they're all owned by the same company. And that's like, and it's kind of the entire chain too. It's like the eye doctors, the manufacturer of the lenses, the frames, all that kind of stuff. They're basically all owned by the same company. And that led to things where they could basically price gouge people. They say, well, we basically set the price because we have a monopoly effectively. And then you had innovation come in with like Warby Parker and companies like that, where they're like, well, we're not going to stand for that. And they do more. But sorry, I keep going off of the tech thing. I want to talk about the tech thing. When it comes to things like Facebook, well, now there's impacts of, okay, advertising, and now people are basically addicted to their devices because of some of the things these social media companies are doing. And yeah, I guess when it comes to the tech thing and some of these technologies people are interacting with every day, is there anything around the innovation or regulation that pops into your head, Ryder?
I think that these were new models, and at the time we were unaware of what needed to be regulated. We didn't know what the fallout was going to be. We didn't know what they were even harvesting. The idea that this was a purely advertising might have shown up in a couple of magazines early on, but the idea that you could sell something really cheap or give it away free and get advertising for it was a fairly new model on the internet. And when they sort of tackled that and were using this algorithm, we didn't know they'd be collecting exhaust data. We didn't know they'd find ways to monetize all of that. So that's the other side, is that we didn't have a crystal ball to look into the future. Now we see things and people get irate about it. I can't believe you took my privacy. These are my rights, and so there's something interesting about the move fast and break something. Is it's a form of sort of piracy, which is how a lot of companies rise to the top. They innovate something new, they get out in front of the laws and regulations, and then from then on, they have a voice in setting the policy, rules, and regulations for the future. So that's one of the things now, is that Facebook, Zuckerberg is talking all the time in front of Congress. And I think
Right.
that's also sort of an interesting thing, is to get to that point where you're so powerful that the government is also paying attention to you, right? Not just the citizens, because you're now a monetized brand. So I'm kind of interested in how that shapes up and takes off. But it's also
Nice rocket joke.
privatizing. Oh, yeah, there you go. But it's also privatizing things that were at one point sort of unknowns. And so when we're talking about innovation, yes, there should be a reward for innovating, coming up with something new. When it comes time for regulation, yeah, we should do it. But I think this is also part of the process. It's also interesting to see how irate people get about it, as if they didn't know. And I think there's been a lot of evidence out there. There just have been people not looking. And so
Yeah.
then to all of a sudden sort of claim that you were the victim is kind of difficult, at least if you're aware. And this is the other side of regulation, is it's often to protect citizens from bad practices or from forms of innovation that can have disastrous results. And so you don't want snake oil salesmen out there poisoning
Right.
people with chloroquine or whatever the heck it is.
Yeah. And one of the things that, oh man, sometimes today just going right out of one ear. Maybe I just should close that ear up, keep those leaks inside. So No, that one's gone. I'm not gonna pull that one back.
Yay. Yeah.
Give me a
No,
little
I
bit from that
mean,
last sentence or last
no.
thought and
I
see if
mean,
I can
it.
bring it back.
Well, I think basically, I'm just going off into this is new terrain. We now have surveillance capitalism and all these things coming out of it, but we don't know how to regulate until it comes out. But also, the government is going to grab onto these new innovations
Right,
anyway,
right, right.
use them
Okay.
for themselves, and so there's a whole bunch of sort of conflicted things that happen here. And if we're reliant on the government for our regulation rather than having a social voice that determines what the regulation should be, well, the government is now sort of also, in a lot of ways, in the pocket of money and finance.
Right. Okay. So that brought up some points, and we're not going to be able to discuss them all at length today because we're getting near our time. But I wanted to bring them up. So one is deciding what can you protect, what can you copyright, what can you patent. Another one is talking about hey, okay, how does this regulation actually happen? And there's this whole thing that these industries, these companies, they influence what gets regulated and how it gets regulated. And there's this thing called lobbying, which is where politicians are using money, or not politicians, companies largely, and industry groups are using money to give to the congressmen and things like that in order to say, hey, we're going to give you this money. We're going to fund your campaigns if you vote in our favor type of thing. And so that's another thing that gets kind of hairy really fast. And then there's a third one that I'm not going to remember right now. But first, let me talk about the
Oh, and I've got about 2 minutes.
yeah. Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So okay, with the funding of the industry groups and the lobbying. Any thoughts on that before you go?
Yeah, it's. Uh, I think there's a lot of conversation around money involving that, right? Is that once you have money, you can afford the lobbying. So, it's more difficult to get the lobbying if you don't have the funding, and so there do seem to be financial incentives that actually spur that on.
Yeah, and then for the what you can patent, what you can copyright thing, there's an interesting discussion where it's like in technology, because it's not a physical good, like it used to be like, hey, we built this thing, you can't make a thing that's exactly like that. But then there's this whole discussion that comes up about innovation in software. And it's like, well, what can you patent? And there's this big patent war between Apple and Samsung. And there is an issue where even something as simple as the swipe to unlock is something that they were trying to patent, and I think they actually did. And so it's like, hey, that seems like something that's so basic on one hand, but yet it's not in my mind. And a lot of people were pushing for like, oh, you can't copyright software, you can't patent something like that. But I'm like, in my opinion, actually, no, I do think an innovation happened there, and I do think there should be some protection. Now, that being said, maybe something like that shouldn't be protected for, as long as another patent would, because it's not as novel, if you will. But that kind of gets to this whole concept of, hey, this country has been around for 200 something years, and a lot of the laws and stuff need to be updated to be more in line with where we're at in 2022 with this culture of innovation and technology. Because guess what? They weren't written for this type of world. So there's a whole lot more we could dive into and all of that. Ryder, any last thoughts before you run?
No, I mean, this conversation could go on forever because it's a deep one. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of deep ones, that's all I'll say about that. Have a great day, Ryder. You have a great one.
Bye bye.
So Ryder had to jump, but I'll go ahead and give us the recap for today and a challenge. So today we've been talking about innovation and regulation. And for those who are familiar with the topics at all, you'll recognize that there's no way we could do either of those topics full justice in the time we're given, but we just wanted to start the discussion, start you guys thinking about these things, because the reality is unless you're interested in this, kind of like I am, if you're a little bit of a nerd for business things, technology things, and even or government things, any one of those things, then you might not know about these things. You might not have thought about these things. Another issue that we didn't bring up was the concept of a lot of our government people aren't educated that well on these types of things. Excuse me. And this became very apparent when some of these trials started to go on with some of these tech companies. There were things like when Facebook was in Congress or whatnot, they were talking about, or there was one congressman who was like, oh, it just didn't even understand how the advertising worked at all, didn't understand how the company made money. And I think there was one that said something about like liking his page or something silly, where it's like, look, clearly these guys do not know enough about this company, about this industry, to be able to be making decisions, intelligent, informed decisions on the things that they're regulating. And so that was a big thing of discussion over the last few years. And there was at one point a division, I forget the fancy word, but within the government that had to do with technology. And basically their point was to have the government be up to date on technology and the digital service, maybe it might be what it's called. You can Google Digital Technology Agency in America, and it'll probably come up. It used to exist, and then one of the presidents got rid of it and said, hey, we're not going to do that anymore. And now I believe there's a movement or proposition out there to start that thing up again. But that leads to things like, for example, the healthcare.gov, the website when it first came out was a complete joke. And so they brought in people and they've revamped it. And this digital agency now has been used to help revamp a lot of government websites and bring technology into the government. And so they've been one way to help get the government a little bit more aligned and a little bit more in knowledge about what's going on in these industries and helping them understand stuff. So that's a big part of it too when it comes to regulation, is talking about education of the people who are actually making the decisions. So as Ryder mentioned, we could talk about this forever. So let me go ahead and jump to the recap for today. So today, when we were talking about innovation and regulation, we talked a little bit about how with technology and there's things like war and crisis, so war and COVID and like the Depression and the Cold War, things like that, where there's these big crises that are happening that warrant a lot of money and attention and energy, and that leads to a bunch of technology innovation. So World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, for example, through all of those, we did a whole bunch of technology innovation. One was to make better, bigger guns, better science-y things that help with that, missiles, rockets, going to the moon, things like that. And then also some of that too, for example, in World War II, a lot of that was ramping up our manufacturing capability and within the U.S. And so by doing all of these things, and also within World War II, bringing in women into the workplace. You may not be familiar with that, but that was a huge step, and that led a lot to the women's rights movement and getting women's roles, as just housewives, changed. So, not only do these things that happen, this innovation that happens a lot of times during crises, not only do they affect the technology, but they also oftentimes have effect on the society as a whole. And so they're very important things to know, and they're very important things to think about and to realize, because it affects your everyday life. So as we were talking about some of the innovation that was happening, we talked about nuclear development and how it started out as bomb, which, as a fun fact, was the first nuclear reaction was done under a football stadium inside of Chicago before they started to move that testing further away from people. But we also talked about, hey, as that nuclear stuff got developed further, people will realize that it could be a little bit dangerous, especially as they got used in bombs and things like that, which led to some regulation and led to, for example, less nuclear power plants. So we talked a little bit about that. We then talked about kind of a mix between public and private partnership when we talked about the telecommunication industry and how the quote unquote pipes, where all the data is going, the lines the data is going on the internet, on your cell phone, things like that. Well, those pipes were largely funded by the government in combination with the private company, whether it be Ma Bell, which was AT&T before they got broke up. And now the thing is about that is, okay, the government helped supply this money for the innovation, but then it kind of gave this company an unfair advantage, and it made it harder for other companies to break into the market, to have competition, to help then spur innovation and help that industry keep going and developing. And so that's why eventually that company got broken up, and now there are more companies that are competing, which leads to an overall healthier market. Then Other than that, we talked a little bit more about regulation and how it comes to, lobbying gets into play, which is where companies and organizations, they go and talk to the government and they say, hey, we want you to do these things, and here's some money for your campaigns to also kind of help grease the skids. And obviously there's some problems that can come from that. And we also, in there, we talked about the drug industry and the technology industry and how innovation in those areas can lead to some other issues, some of which are obvious and some of which aren't quite so obvious. For example, with Facebook and some of those similar tech companies, we're just now realizing kind of some of the troubles that we can run into now that those things are done at scale. Facebook is a company that touches billions of people, and oftentimes every day, and if not every day, very regularly. And there's just not a lot of history of companies that exist at that scale. And because they're at that scale, it leads to a lot of issues and problems and questions that we barely scratch the surface of today. Just to quickly rattle off a couple of the possibilities. One, with Facebook, for example, one of the things that they've done is as they go into developing countries, they actually put up infrastructure to give those countries internet. However, that means that the people in that country, their view of the world, their view of the internet is largely through Facebook's portal. And so obviously there can be some issues that come up with that. Like, yes, it's great that now a private company has helped provide infrastructure and help provide internet to these people, but it's something we should be careful about because there's, some questionable things in there. And oh, by the way, Facebook, now Meta, is a bit of a questionable company based off of some of the things that they've done. So yeah, their motto, by the way, used to be move fast and break things. Is that a good thing still? I don't know. So there's at least one of the things. Of course, like I said, I could keep going forever, but let's wrap that up for today. Let's bring it into a challenge. So a challenge among innovation and regulation. I think a good challenge for this one is to pick something that you're interested in. Pick something that you like. Maybe it's your cell phone. Maybe it's social media. Maybe it's some technology you use every day, like the microwave. Pick something where you're like, hey, what is this thing? I use this thing all the time. I like it a lot, or maybe I'm just curious about it. I've always wondered. And look into a little bit of the history. Look into the backstory. Look into the innovations that happen to make it possible. And this can get really interesting, and you could end up diving down a whole bunch of rabbit holes if you pick something that's pretty complex. So for example, the James Webb Space Telescope, there are a lot of innovations that needed to happen for that thing to work. And so you can look at that and you can say, hey, okay, for example, one thing is, this is, for those who aren't aware, this is a telescope that's launched into space, and it will stay in space, and it's looking way deep into the deep, deep space, which is very, very far away. But one of the ways let me start that again. For where it sits, the way it's going to have to work is one side of it is going to be exposed to the sun, and it is going to have temperatures that are super, 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 super hot. However, for the telescope to work well, for it to be able to see super far, the opposite end of that same telescope is going to be crazy, crazy cold, like almost near absolute zero. It's so cold. And so on one side you have like super, super cold. On the other side, you have super, super hot. So how do you have, think of like your phone or something. Like, how do you have a device like that where on one side it's super hot and the other side super cold? And so there's naturally a bunch of things that need to be developed to enable that technology to happen. And that's just one of the things that needed to happen. So it's kind of cool to pick something complex like that, and then you can follow it back and say, oh, well, that needed to be invented. But before that could be invented, this needed to be invented, and you can kind of start following it back, and it could get real interesting real quick. But of course, you can also pick something a little simpler. And oh, by the way, maybe that has to do something with food. Did you know that food actually can be patented? And that's a thing in the restaurant industry, certain techniques or whatnot. Some things are patented, but only with certain language. Some things are kept as trade secrets, so they don't want to patent them because they don't want people to know how they're made, because patents do expire. So there's a whole lot of discussion in there, and we could go in a lot further. But with that, that's good for one day. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy Thursday.